Clara Moretti had always believed that New York City rewarded those who worked the hardest, that the sleepless streets and silver skyscrapers were built by the kind of stubborn souls who refused to give up even when the world around them tried to crush them. But by the time she turned 40, with bills piled like dead leaves on her kitchen table and her heart heavy from betrayal, that old belief had turned into a bitter joke she whispered to herself to fill the silence between collection calls and late-night tears, her laughter hollow and cracked like the paint on the apartment walls she could no longer afford to repair. And it all seemed to have begun with Alan Mercer, the man who once promised her forever but delivered only a slow-motion collapse. A charming grin masking the debt he hid behind their shared dreams, the man who said he loved her with the same voice that later told her it was just business when her savings disappeared into an investment that never existed. She could still remember the day he walked out, the way the door clicked shut with such finality that it sounded like a gunshot, leaving her and 15-year-old Lila in the echoing apartment that smelled of coffee gone cold and unpaid rent. The kind of scent that sticks to your soul when you realize love can be weaponized by someone who knows exactly how to make you trust them. The days that followed felt like drowning in slow motion. Every morning she would wake to Lila's hopeful eyes and force a smile she didn't feel, pushing herself to get dressed, to send out resumes to offices that would never call back, to fight off the shame that gnawed at her ribs like hunger. Because she had built her boutique from nothing once before and she told herself she could do it again, except the world wasn't the same now. The economy had soured, her credit score had collapsed like a paper house in the rain, and people she once called friends vanished as soon as her bank account emptied, their texts unanswered, their pity avoided because pity was worse than cruelty. Yet through it all, Lila stayed kind, staying up late to draw pictures of the two of them smiling, leaving them taped to the fridge like little prayers, and it was those drawings that kept Clara from walking into the river some nights when the weight of failure felt too heavy to carry. It was around that time that the scam began, though Clara didn't know it yet. An email, clean and professional, offering debt relief through a verified government program, complete with logos and signatures and fine print that looked real enough to believe when you were desperate and running out of time, and she had been so tired, so broken, that she wanted to believe it, to believe someone out there wanted to help her climb out of the hole instead of digging it deeper. So she sent the application, signed her name, gave them her information, and within a week the little she had left was gone, siphoned out of her account like blood from a wound, leaving behind only an automated message, "We're sorry, your request cannot be processed at this time." She stared at those words for hours, numb, her coffee growing cold, her reflection in the laptop screen ghostly and pale, and when Lila came home from school, she lied, said everything was fine, said the money was tied up for a few days, and that night she went to bed clutching her phone, scrolling through articles about scams, hating herself for being so foolish, but mostly hating Alan for teaching her how to doubt her own judgment, for making her so scared of being alone that she stopped seeing danger when it wore a friendly face. As the weeks bled into months, the city around her kept moving, indifferent and alive, and Clara began taking odd jobs, cleaning offices at night, delivering groceries, translating documents online for people who never paid on time, and though it wasn't enough, she tried to turn each humiliation into fuel, telling herself that survival itself was a kind of revenge, that one day she would rise from all this and look down at the skyline not as a victim but as someone who took her pain and built something new. But then came the eviction notice, thin paper with thick consequences, and she stood there reading it under the flickering hallway light while Lila slept, her hand trembling, her mind a storm of panic. And she realized that she had run out of miracles, out of luck, and out of time. The next morning, she swallowed her pride and went to Alan's new office downtown. She had discovered through a mutual acquaintance that his business was thriving, that the man who once cried in her arms now sat behind glass walls and marble floors, and when she walked in, he smiled as though nothing had happened, as though the betrayal was just a misunderstanding between old friends. She wanted to scream, to claw at that mask of civility, but instead she just asked for help, her voice low and trembling, and he looked at her with a softness that wasn't pity but condescension, the kind that says I already won, and offered her a loan with conditions that sounded too generous, too rehearsed, and though every instinct told her not to sign, she did, because the alternative was the street. For a few months, things seemed better, the loan covered rent, and she managed to find a modest office space to restart her boutique online, selling handmade scarves and jewelry, trying to reclaim the version of herself that once believed in art and purpose, and for a brief moment, life flickered with color again. Lila laughed more, their apartment smelled of lavender and thread instead of fear, and Clara thought maybe, just maybe, she had been given a second chance. But darkness, when invited once, always finds its way back, and soon Alan began calling late at night, demanding repayments she couldn't make, claiming the interest was restructured, his voice slick with manipulation, reminding her of what she owed, not just in money but in humiliation, and she began to understand that his offer of help was never a rescue, it was a leash. The calls became threats, the messages cruel, and one morning she found the lock to her boutique door broken, her merchandise gone, the insurance void because of a clause Alan himself had drafted in the original paperwork. He had planned it all, every step. Her trust turned into his profit. The day she broke was not the day she lost the store but the night she saw Lila crying silently at the kitchen table, clutching her sketchbook to her chest, whispering, "It's going to be okay, right, Mom?" And Clara couldn't answer because she didn't know anymore, and in that silence, something hardened inside her, something ancient and cold, the part of the soul that stops waiting for justice and starts becoming it. She stopped crying after that. She stopped apologizing. She sold what little she had left, pawned her jewelry, used the money to hire a lawyer she couldn't afford, and began digging into Alan's records, into his so-called business empire, uncovering layers of fraud and manipulation so intricate that even the police had overlooked them. It became her new job, not revenge, not yet, but understanding, mapping out the architecture of his deceit the way an artist studies anatomy before painting skin. The more she learned, the angrier she became, but also sharper, calmer. She began sleeping again, not from peace but from purpose. Her transformation did not happen overnight, it was slow, methodical, forged in humiliation and fire, and by the time she found the first crack in his empire, an offshore account tied to a shell company that existed only on paper, she no longer felt like a victim but like a storm gathering its first wind. Alan, meanwhile, began to notice, his tone changed from arrogance to unease, his calls less confident, his words more measured, and Clara knew then that he could feel it too, the balance shifting, the prey learning to hunt. Lila, unaware of the full extent of her mother's war, began thriving at school again, her drawings now brighter, filled with images of the two of them standing before tall buildings bathed in sunlight, and Clara kept them all, each one a reminder of why she couldn't stop, why she had to see this through, because revenge wasn't just about him anymore, it was about reclaiming every version of herself that he had taken away. And so began the long, quiet war, fought not with rage but with intellect, patience, and the kind of precision that only comes from pain, a war that would stretch years, cost friends, test faith, and eventually leave Clara standing on the ruins of everything she once believed love could be. Clara had always believed that revenge, if it ever came to her, would be loud, an explosion, a public reckoning, something cinematic and bright, but when it finally began to take form, it came quietly, like frost creeping across a window pane, a slow, deliberate spread of control reclaiming territory she had once surrendered in despair, and the first real act of defiance was so small that no one would have noticed it except her. She opened a new bank account under her maiden name, hidden from every trace of Alan's network, and began funneling bits of money into it from every odd job she could still manage, a secret reservoir not of wealth but of willpower, a silent declaration that she was no longer his pawn. She had learned by then that vengeance was not a single act but a discipline, and each day she added to her plan the way an architect adds careful strokes to a blueprint, studying Alan's associates, following paper trails, tracing his partnerships through corporations with names so bland they sounded harmless, Mercer Holdings, Crown River Management, Arcadia Consulting, but each one hid a web of deceit where Alan siphoned funds, inflated contracts, and laundered profits from fake investments, and she realized with both horror and awe that he hadn't just ruined her, he had built an empire on ruining others like her, desperate people convinced that salvation was spelled in small print. So she started gathering evidence, saving emails, recording calls, learning legal terms she had once ignored, escrow, fiduciary breach, offshore compliance, turning her grief into a kind of education. Every night, when Lila fell asleep, she'd sit by the dim light of her laptop and type, her fingers trembling not from fear but from determination, compiling what would one day become a case file so vast that it could tear down everything Alan had built, and in those hours she felt alive in a way she hadn't for years, fueled not by hope but by focus, the razor's edge of purpose that cuts through exhaustion and pain. But revenge, she discovered, has a cost that doesn't announce itself until you've already started paying it. The long nights blurred into mornings, and she began missing Lila's school recitals, forgetting to eat, snapping at her daughter over small things she later couldn't remember, and though Lila said she understood, because Lila always understood, Clara could see the worry in her eyes, the silent question of whether her mother was chasing justice or losing herself again. One evening, as autumn settled into the city with its chill and copper light, Lila placed a drawing on Clara's desk, two figures standing at the edge of a bridge, the skyline glowing behind them, one holding the other's hand. "It's us," Lila said softly, "when it's all over." Clara stared at the picture for a long time after her daughter had gone to bed, tears welling not from sadness but from the reminder that revenge couldn't come at the cost of what she loved most. She promised herself, silently, that she would win this war without letting it devour her, though even as she made the promise, she knew how fragile such vows could be. Her next move was riskier. Through her lawyer, a quiet, sharp woman named Evelyn Cruz who believed in justice but charged for hope by the hour, Clara began building a whistleblower case. They met in coffee shops and public libraries, places with noise enough to hide their words, and Evelyn taught her how to document without alerting suspicion, how to protect herself legally, and how to strike only when the evidence was airtight. Alan's arrogance was her greatest weapon. He never imagined she could be capable of navigating his world, let alone turning it against him. And yet, for all her planning, she knew that justice through courts was too slow, too clean. She needed to hit him where it hurt most, his reputation, his control, the illusion of perfection he wore like armor. So she reached out to the others he'd hurt, the silent casualties of his empire, an elderly couple who lost their retirement fund, a single father bankrupted by a fake investment, a young woman who'd been fired after refusing to falsify records. At first, they didn't believe her. Some hung up, others cursed her name, thinking she was part of his scheme. But slowly, painfully, one by one, they began to listen. The world is small when it comes to shared pain, and soon a pattern emerged, a chorus of broken lives that together became undeniable. Meanwhile, Alan's calls shifted from threats to pleasantries, as though he sensed something but didn't yet understand it. He invited her to lunch one afternoon, his voice smooth as silk, and though every part of her wanted to hang up, Clara said yes. She needed to look him in the eye again, to remember the face of the man she was dismantling. They met at a restaurant overlooking Central Park, sunlight filtering through glass walls, the kind of place where people wore smiles as currency. Alan looked immaculate, tailored suit, expensive watch, that same easy grin that once made her knees weaken. "You look good," he said, his tone dripping with familiarity. "I've missed you." The lie was so perfect it almost made her laugh. She smiled back, calm, composed, masking the storm beneath her ribcage. They spoke about meaningless things, the weather, Lila's school, the economy, but underneath, their words were weapons testing each other's defenses. When the waiter brought the check, Alan reached for it, as if to reassert dominance, and Clara placed her hand on his wrist, gentle but firm. "I'll pay," she said. His surprise was brief but visible, and in that instant she saw the first crack in his confidence. Power, she realized, wasn't taken all at once, it was eroded, piece by piece, gesture by gesture. Weeks passed, and her coalition of the broken grew. Together, with Evelyn's help, they gathered testimonies, bank statements, recordings. It was grueling, secretive work, each step a risk, each document a potential trap. Alan began to sense the shifting tide. Rumors reached him, whispers among investors, questions about his integrity. He sent her flowers one day, white lilies, her favorite, the card unsigned but obvious. She threw them away, her hands shaking not with fear but disgust. That night, she received a call from an unknown number, a woman's voice, low and nervous, saying she worked for Alan and that things were happening inside the company, that money was being moved, files deleted. Clara met her in a small diner in Queens, the air thick with grease and secrets, and the woman, whose name was Hannah, slid a flash drive across the table. "This has everything," she whispered. "But if he finds out I gave it to you, I'm done." Clara promised to protect her, though she knew promises in this world were fragile currency. The drive contained more than Clara could have hoped for: fake contracts, offshore transfers, correspondence that tied Alan to fraud cases dating back a decade. It was enough to destroy him publicly, but timing mattered. Evelyn urged patience, release it too early, and he'd bury it, wait too long, and he might escape. Clara found herself living in a state of suspended adrenaline, every day a tightrope between justice and ruin. Lila noticed her absence more, the distance creeping in despite Clara's attempts to bridge it. One evening, Lila confronted her. "You're changing," she said quietly. "You think I don't see it, but I do. I just want Mom back, not this." "Soldier." The words hit harder than any insult Alan could deliver. That night, Clara sat on the floor of her bedroom, the flash drive in her hands, and wondered if revenge was ever truly worth what it costs the living. But fate, cruel as it was, made the choice for her. The next morning, she received a letter, another debt notice, this time from a creditor linked directly to Alan's company, threatening legal action. It was his move, his reminder that he still held strings. Something in her snapped. She called Evelyn, told her it was time. Together they coordinated the release, sending documents to journalists, regulators, and every former client she could reach. Within days, the story exploded across headlines: investment mogul Alan Mercer under investigation for fraud. The fallout was immediate: banks froze his accounts, investors fled, reporters camped outside his penthouse. Clara watched it all unfold on television, numb and exhilarated all at once. When she saw his face on the screen, pale and furious, she didn't smile, she simply exhaled, as if releasing years of poison she had carried inside her lungs. But victory, as she would learn, doesn't bring peace, it only reveals what's left of you after the battle. The stress took its toll. Sleepless nights, constant calls from journalists, the threat of retaliation. One evening, returning home from yet another meeting, she found her apartment door ajar. Panic surged through her, but inside, nothing was stolen, just a single note on the table: "You don't win, Clara. You just survive." There was no signature, but she knew the handwriting. She burned the note over the sink, watched the paper curl into ash, and whispered, "Then I'll survive better than you ever could." From then on, she carried herself differently, less as a victim seeking justice, more as a survivor defining her own peace. As Alan's empire crumbled, Clara's life slowly began to mend in quiet, unglamorous ways. She took Lila to Coney Island one chilly afternoon, the first real outing they'd had in months. They rode the Ferris wheel, the city sprawled below them, and for the first time in years, Clara laughed, a real laugh, not the brittle imitation she'd worn for survival. Lila looked at her, eyes wide, and said, "You look happy, Mom." And in that moment, Clara realized she wasn't chasing revenge anymore, she was reclaiming life. The war wasn't over, there would be court cases, hearings, more shadows, but she no longer felt hollow. She had fought, she had endured, and in surviving, she had already won more than Alan ever could. The weeks that followed Alan's public collapse felt unreal, as though Clara were walking through a dream she had imagined too vividly to believe it could ever come true, because after years of fighting, of sleepless nights and trembling hands, she expected the world to shift in some grand, cinematic way once he fell, but New York went on unchanged, the trains still ran, the lights still burned, and people still hurried past one another as though nothing extraordinary had happened, and she realized that even victory, when it finally comes, can feel eerily quiet. Alan's name was everywhere, on news tickers, in articles, whispered in cafes by strangers who didn't know they were speaking about the ghost who had haunted her life, and yet she stayed silent, hidden behind anonymity, letting the world devour him without ever claiming credit. There was satisfaction in that restraint, in knowing he would never truly understand how completely she had undone him. But once the adrenaline faded, an emptiness began to grow where the rage had once lived, a hollow ache that no headline could fill, because revenge had been her compass for so long that without it she felt disoriented, unsure of who she was without the war. Lila noticed it too, her mother's quiet detachment, the way she drifted through mornings as though she were listening for something only she could hear, and one night, over takeout boxes and cooling tea, she asked, "So, what happens now?" Clara didn't answer right away. She looked out the window instead, at the blur of headlights on the wet street below, and finally said, "Now we live." The word sounded brave, but inside she wondered if she still knew how. Living, it turned out, was harder than surviving. She had spent so long fighting to destroy something that she'd forgotten how to build. Her boutique was gone, her reputation still tangled in the online chaos of Alan's scandal, and though Eveline promised restitution from the lawsuits, Clara couldn't bring herself to wait idly for justice anymore. She began looking for work again, real, honest work, and after a string of humiliating interviews where she was either overqualified or not the right cultural fit, she found a position at a nonprofit in Brooklyn that helped women rebuild their lives after financial abuse. The irony wasn't lost on her. The office was small, the pay modest, but the mission was everything she wished someone had offered her when she was drowning. Her first day felt like exhaling after years of holding her breath. The women who came through those doors carried the same hollow-eyed exhaustion she once wore, and in them, Clara found both pain and purpose. She listened to their stories, filled out their forms, helped them find lawyers, housing, credit counselors, and in each act of guidance, she stitched a little of herself back together. But healing isn't linear, and peace doesn't erase scars. There were nights when she still woke sweating, convinced she'd hear Alan's voice on the phone again, that the door would creak open to another betrayal, and on those nights she would quietly move to the kitchen, make tea, and remind herself aloud, "He can't hurt you anymore." Still, ghosts have a way of testing conviction, and one evening, while sorting through emails at work, she saw his name again, not directly, but in a forwarded article about his ongoing trial. He had pled not guilty, of course, blaming his subordinates, spinning lies with the same ease he once spun promises. There was even a quote, "I was misled by those I trusted." Clara felt a cold laugh rise in her throat. She closed the laptop and walked out into the winter air, the city lights sharp as stars, and realized that she no longer needed to see him punished further. The world would handle that on its own. Her part of the story was over. What mattered now was Lila, and herself. Lila, meanwhile, was growing up faster than Clara could keep up with. 16 now, confident, thoughtful, with the same fierce empathy that had once kept her mother from falling apart, she had begun talking about art school, about leaving New York someday to study design. The thought terrified Clara and filled her with pride in equal measure. They had spent so many years clinging to each other in crisis that imagining distance felt unnatural, yet necessary. One Saturday, they took a walk through Central Park, bundled against the cold, and Lila said, "I think you should start your boutique again. Not for money, for you." Clara smiled, shaking her head, but that night she sat at the old sewing machine that had survived every move, every eviction, and for the first time in years, she created something not out of desperation but joy, a silk scarf, deep blue with gold thread edges, imperfect but hers. When she finished, she laughed quietly, and Lila, watching from the doorway, said, "You look like you again." By spring, life had settled into something resembling normalcy. Alan's case dragged through the courts. Evelyn occasionally sent updates, asset seizures, depositions, the usual slow machinery of justice, but Clara rarely read them. She was too busy living. The nonprofit promoted her to coordinator, her boutique began to find customers online again through word of mouth, and on weekends she and Lila would visit the farmers market near Union Square, drinking coffee, talking about everything and nothing. Some days, she caught herself smiling without reason, surprised by the unfamiliar lightness. The city, once hostile and cold, now felt like home again, not because it had changed but because she had. There was still debt to pay, still scars that flared when memories brushed too close, but they were part of her story now, not the whole of it. And on the one-year anniversary of Alan's arrest, she stood by the East River, watching the water catch the evening light, and whispered a small goodbye, not to him, but to the version of herself who once believed love had to hurt to be real. She turned to walk home, and in that moment, a strange calm settled over her, the kind that comes only when you realize the worst has already happened and you're still standing. Her phone buzzed then, a message from Evelyn. He took a plea deal. 5 years, minimum. Clara stared at the words, then smiled faintly, not from triumph but from closure. "Good," she murmured to the wind. "Let it end." When she got home, Lila was waiting with 2 mugs of cocoa, and they sat by the window, watching the rain trace silver lines down the glass. "You okay?" Lila asked. Clara nodded. "For the first time in a long time," she said, "I think I am." Winter arrived slowly, settling over New York with a soft hush that blanketed the streets in frost and quiet reflection. Clara had never liked winter, its sharpness reminded her too much of the cold nights she had spent alone, tallying debts and staring at an empty ceiling, but this year it felt different. There was warmth inside their apartment, the golden glow of string lights reflecting off Lila's growing collection of paintings and sketches. Clara often found herself lingering over a cup of tea by the window, watching steam curl into the cold air outside, feeling a rare serenity she once thought impossible. She had rebuilt her life on small victories, her boutique gaining steady sales, her nonprofit work helping women like herself, and Lila flourishing in art school. It wasn't perfection, but it was enough. One snowy evening, as Clara and Lila returned from a neighborhood holiday market, they found a stray cat shivering on the steps of their building. Lila immediately crouched down, murmuring gentle words, while Clara hesitated, remembering the caution and disappointment of past missteps. But there was something in the small creature's eyes, trust despite danger, that stirred a protective instinct. They brought the cat inside, wrapping it in a blanket and warming it by the radiator. Naming it Whisker, Lila insisted it be part of their family, and Clara allowed herself to feel the simple joy of giving care without expectation. Whisker became a quiet companion, padding across the apartment, curling into Lila's lap, or sneaking onto Clara's desk while she worked. The cat's presence reminded her daily that life, no matter how fractured, could always offer moments of tenderness. Clara also began reconnecting with friends she had distanced herself from during the chaos of Alan's schemes. One of them, Mara, invited her to a small gathering in the East Village, a mix of artists, writers, and social workers. Clara felt awkward at first, wary of judgment, but she was surprised at how easy it felt to converse. Stories of resilience, laughter, and shared experience flowed effortlessly. By the end of the night, she realized she had been isolated unnecessarily for so long, and that connection was a form of freedom in itself. Walking home with Lila the next morning through streets glittering with frost, she thought of how far she had come from the woman who once believed trust was a weapon rather than a bridge. Spring came slowly, and with it, unexpected opportunities. A local publisher approached Clara with the idea of writing a memoir, not about Alan, but about her journey through financial betrayal, heartbreak, and the art of rebuilding. The proposal terrified her at first. Exposing her life felt like stepping naked into a public square. But after weeks of reflection, she realized that sharing her story could help others navigate the chaos she had endured. Writing became cathartic. She poured pain, hope, grief, and triumph into every page, letting memories of fear and struggle coexist with moments of happiness and clarity. Lila often sat beside her, sketching quietly, offering occasional encouragement or a soft laugh when her mother became too tense. By the time the manuscript was finished, Clara felt as if she had exorcised old ghosts, leaving only lessons and resilience in their place. With the book nearing publication, Clara found herself reflecting on the nature of happiness. It wasn't a constant euphoria, she realized, but a series of small, steady moments, a quiet morning with tea, laughter echoing in a sunlit room, watching Lila explore the world without fear. Each memory of hardship remained, but it no longer dictated her every thought. She began taking long walks along the East River, breathing in the air, watching the skyline transform under the shifting light. These walks became rituals, opportunities to observe life continuing, boats gliding across the water, joggers passing, couples holding hands, without the weight of her past pressing against her chest. By summer, Clara's boutique had grown enough that she could employ a small assistant, a young woman who reminded Clara of herself at that age, hopeful but weary, eager to learn. Mentoring her brought a new dimension of purpose, reinforcing that Clara's hard-earned knowledge could guide others. Lila, meanwhile, thrived at her art school, her exhibitions drawing attention and praise. One evening, after a gallery opening, Clara and Lila sat on their apartment balcony with Whisker curled between them, sipping lemonade and listening to the distant hum of the city. "We made it, Mom," Lila said softly. Clara nodded, squeezing her daughter's hand. "Yes, we did," she replied. In the quiet moments that followed, Clara felt an almost dizzying gratitude, for survival, for love, for the lessons of pain that had shaped her into someone stronger and more compassionate. There was no grandiose finale, no dramatic closure, just the ongoing rhythm of life, its ups and downs, its laughter and tears, its small victories and quiet peace. The city, once a place of fear and betrayal, had become a sanctuary, and in its chaos, she had found clarity. Clara realized that revenge had been a necessary chapter, but not the ending. The ending belonged to her own heart, fully alive, fully present, and fully at peace. Autumn crept into New York with its crisp air and amber leaves, casting a quiet magic over the city that Clara found almost meditative. The apartment had grown into a true home, walls lined with Lila's evolving artwork, stacks of books that Clara had longed to read, and scarves draped over chairs, ready for new customers. Each morning, she brewed coffee and watched the city wake, the light dancing across the rooftops, and felt a deep, grounding contentment that she hadn't known in years. She was no longer defined by betrayal or loss, she was defined by the life she had chosen to build, step by careful step. Work at the nonprofit continued to give her purpose, but Clara also started dedicating time to her boutique in a way she hadn't allowed herself before. She experimented with designs, fabrics, and patterns, taking risks she once would have shied away from. Each scarf, each piece of clothing, carried a piece of her history, pain transformed into beauty. Customers began leaving heartfelt notes, thanking her not just for her products but for the care she poured into each creation. Clara tucked these messages into a drawer, pulling them out when doubt crept in, as reminders that resilience could radiate far beyond her own life. One evening, As she was finishing a particularly intricate silk scarf, Lila came running in from the balcony, waving an envelope. "Mom. It's from the publisher. They loved the manuscript." Clara's hands stilled, her heart skipping in disbelief and joy. The book, once a private excavation of pain and perseverance, was finally going to see the light of day. Tears blurred her vision as Lila hugged her tightly, whispering, "You did it, Mom. You really did it." That night, for the first time in decades, Clara allowed herself to imagine the future not as a battleground but as a canvas, each moment waiting to be painted with possibility. Winter arrived again, gentle yet insistent, and with it came another unexpected turn. The stray cat, Whisker, had grown into a companion as constant as Lila's laughter or the hum of the city. Clara found herself smiling more freely, feeling lighter than she had in years. Evenings were spent with Lila sketching, Whisker curling between them, and Clara often caught herself humming old songs, letting music fill spaces that fear once occupied. The city, relentless as ever, now felt alive with opportunity rather than threat. The release of her book marked a turning point. Clara received letters from women across the country, thanking her for sharing her story. Many had faced similar betrayals, financial hardships, or heartbreak, and they saw in Clara's journey a roadmap to survival and self-reclamation. She began to speak at events, sometimes to rooms full of strangers, sometimes to small gatherings of survivors, and each time she found herself speaking not from anger but from the well of wisdom born of endurance. The applause, the nods, the quiet tears she saw in her audience, all of it reminded her that healing was not just personal, it was contagious. Through all of this, Lila continued to grow into a remarkable young woman, her talent and empathy deepening with each passing day. They often walked together in Central Park, talking about dreams, art, love, and the future. Lila's confidence became a mirror reflecting Clara's own strength, a living testament to the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. And on nights when Clara felt a shadow of doubt or the ghost of past pain, she would glance at Lila, at the light in her eyes, and remember why survival and perseverance mattered so profoundly. As spring approached, Clara took stock of her journey. She realized that the revenge she had once obsessed over was merely a chapter, a catalyst that had propelled her toward self-discovery. The love, joy, and peace she now experienced were victories that no one could steal. One afternoon, while arranging scarves for a new collection, she paused and looked around the apartment, at Lila sketching by the window, Whisker dozing in the sun, the city sprawling endlessly beyond. For the first time in her life, Clara felt wholly present, unburdened by the past, ready to embrace whatever came next with open arms and a resilient heart. The city was waking to another spring, soft light spilling over the rooftops and streets of Queens, filtering into Clara's apartment where Lila was already busy at her easel. Clara sipped her coffee, savoring the calm, and allowed herself to linger on the thought that life, at long last, had settled into a rhythm of stability and quiet joy. There were still bills to pay, occasional shortages in inventory, and the small setbacks that came with running a boutique, but none of it carried the weight of desperation she once knew. Each day felt like a deliberate choice to live fully, and she took it with gratitude and care. The boutique had grown steadily, its reputation built on both quality and Clara's sincerity. She now had a small team of assistants who adored her warmth and dedication, and she often found herself mentoring them with the same patience she once wished she had been shown. Every day brought small victories, a client complimenting a design, a shipment arriving on time, a social media post garnering more attention than expected. Clara learned to savor these moments because they were hers, built on effort and persistence rather than manipulation or chance. Lila, meanwhile, was thriving. Her art had begun to gain attention outside of school, with galleries reaching out for exhibits and collaborative projects. Clara watched her daughter navigate the world with curiosity and courage, and she felt a swelling pride, knowing that the lessons of resilience she had fought so hard to teach were taking root. Lila would sometimes pause mid-sketch and ask for advice, or just for her mother's presence, and those moments became sacred, a bridge between the past and a future Clara was finally able to welcome. One warm afternoon, Clara received an email from a foundation that supported women entrepreneurs. They had learned of her boutique and nonprofit work and wanted to feature her in a series about women reclaiming their lives after hardship. The request filled her with nervous excitement. Exposure had always been a double-edged sword. But this time, she approached it differently. She agreed, not to prove anything to anyone, but to celebrate the path she had walked. The resulting article brought more attention to her scarves, her nonprofit, and, subtly, to the story of survival and endurance that underpinned it all. She found herself fielding messages from women who had faced betrayal, fraud, or personal loss, sharing their gratitude and their stories. Clara answered each one with care, finding in their courage a reflection of her own journey. Life was not without challenges. There were moments when old memories returned unbidden, the sting of betrayal, the nights of uncertainty, the weight of debt, but now she faced them differently. Where once they had paralyzed her, now they were reminders of strength and endurance. She had become a student of her own life, learning to navigate hardship with grace and perspective. On quiet evenings, she would sit on her balcony, whisker in her lap, Lila nearby, and watch the city lights flicker, each a story, each a life moving forward despite adversity. It was humbling and reassuring all at once. By summer, Clara began planning a small vacation for her and Lila. Nothing extravagant, just a week in the Catskills, where they could hike, paint, and breathe in the serenity of nature. Preparing for it, she felt a lightness she hadn't known in decades. It wasn't merely a break from routine but a celebration of survival, of the life they had carved together from chaos. Lila packed sketches and a journal, talking animatedly about the streams they would find and the skies they would paint. Clara listened and smiled, thinking how remarkable it was that the very daughter who had been her reason to survive was now also a reason to thrive. As they drove north out of the city, the skyline shrinking behind them, Clara felt a sense of liberation. The skyscrapers, once symbols of struggle and isolation, now seemed distant, reminders of battles fought but no longer defining her. The air was fresher, lighter, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and she let herself inhale it deeply. For the first time in years, she felt that the past existed not as a burden but as a teacher. Every hardship, every tear, every sleepless night had led her here, to a place of calm, strength, and hope. During that week in the mountains, Clara and Lila hiked trails that twisted through thick forests and over gentle streams. They sketched, painted, and spoke openly about dreams, fears, and the past. On one particular morning, as the sun rose over the peaks, casting golden light across the valley, Clara realized that peace wasn't a final destination, it was a series of moments, small and quiet, that could be collected over a lifetime. Standing beside her daughter, feeling the wind against her face, she allowed herself to cry, soft tears of gratitude, release, and joy. It was not sadness but affirmation. Life had tested her, and she had endured. Returning to the city, Clara felt rejuvenated, carrying with her a sense of calm determination. The boutique thrived, Lila's art continued to gain recognition, and her nonprofit work expanded into a small network that supported women across New York City. The cycles of hardship and triumph had taught her that life was rarely linear. There would always be challenges, but they could be met with patience, wisdom, and courage. And so, Clara moved forward, aware that the peace she now held was both fragile and resilient, precious because it had been hard-won and permanent because it had been chosen. The arrival of fall in New York brought with it a palette of amber, crimson, and gold that seemed to set the city aflame with beauty. Clara walked Lila to school each morning, the fallen leaves crunching underfoot, and felt a steady rhythm in her chest that had been absent for years. Life was no longer a series of emergencies or betrayals, it had a cadence, a pulse, a quiet joy she had almost forgotten existed. The boutique was thriving steadily, and Clara had even begun teaching small weekend workshops for young women who dreamed of entrepreneurship, sharing both practical skills and hard-won wisdom. She found a new satisfaction in mentoring, seeing herself reflected in eager, hopeful faces, and guiding them past the pitfalls she had once endured. One crisp morning, Clara received a letter from a woman in another borough, thanking her for a talk she had given months ago. The note was handwritten, fragile and earnest, telling of struggles with debt, heartbreak, and an untrustworthy partner, and expressing deep gratitude for Clara's advice and encouragement. Clara held the letter close to her chest, tears prickling her eyes, realizing how far-reaching the ripple of her life could be. It was more than validation, it was a tangible symbol of hope moving through the world, proof that survival could inspire others to fight, to persist, and to heal. Lila, now a confident 17-year-old, began exploring local galleries with her mother, learning the nuances of curating exhibitions and connecting with artists. Clara loved watching her daughter navigate this new world, her youthful determination tempered by insight and patience. One evening, Lila returned from a gallery showing with glowing news. A collector wanted to purchase one of her pieces for a permanent collection. Clara's heart swelled as she hugged her daughter, whispering, "I always knew you would find your light." Lila smiled, eyes bright. "It's easier to shine when I know you're here, Mom." Clara continued to write as well. Her memoir had been published and well received, but she discovered a love for storytelling that went beyond her own experiences. She began drafting a novel inspired by the women she met through her nonprofit work, weaving fiction with the raw truths she had learned. Writing became her sanctuary, a space where she could explore emotions without fear, allowing moments of sadness, joy, and hope to flow freely. Evenings were spent at her desk with Whisker curled nearby, the quiet hum of city life outside blending with the tapping of keys and the soft scratch of pencil on paper from Lila's sketches. Winter approached again, bringing with it frost and the familiar hush that had once reminded Clara of loneliness. But now, the hush was different, it was peaceful. She decorated the apartment with simple lights, homemade wreaths, and small ornaments, creating a space that felt safe and celebratory. Lila had begun a tradition of baking cookies for neighbors and friends, a small act of community that warmed their hearts and built connections they had once lacked. Clara watched her daughter with pride, realizing that love, care, and persistence could reshape even the hardest winters into moments of warmth. By the following spring, Clara had organized a small charity auction through her boutique, featuring artwork, scarves, and other handmade items donated by the community. Proceeds went toward programs for women facing financial hardship, and the event was a resounding success. Clara gave a quiet speech, speaking not of revenge, but of resilience, of hope, and of the quiet courage required to rebuild a life. Lila stood beside her, beaming, understanding that this was not merely about charity, it was about reclaiming power, dignity, and the right to thrive after adversity. Life continued in this pattern of steady, graceful progression. Clara grew more confident, more content, and more attuned to the rhythms of her own heart. She no longer feared the past, nor did she obsess over what could have been. Instead, she celebrated the life she had built. The city, once a place of shadows and threats, now mirrored her own journey, complex, vibrant, and full of possibility. Evenings on the balcony, the hum of the city beneath her, Whisker purring in her lap, and Lila sketching beside her, became sacred rituals. It was a life built slowly, deliberately, and tenderly, a life reclaimed from ashes, grounded in resilience, love, and enduring hope. Spring was in full bloom, and New York seemed to exhale with new life. Clara found herself walking through the streets, noticing the soft pink blossoms along the avenues and the chatter of neighbors emerging from winter hibernation. She carried a sense of quiet triumph with her, not one that demanded recognition, but one that was deeply internal, proof of the life she had nurtured from the ruins of betrayal and hardship. Lila was more independent now, often taking the subway alone to attend gallery meetings or art classes, yet always returning with stories that made Clara laugh or marvel at her daughter's maturity. These moments, small and fleeting, were treasures. At the boutique, Clara launched a new line of scarves inspired by the city itself, the skyline at sunrise, the sparkling reflections of the East River, the warmth of autumn leaves even in spring. Each piece carried a subtle story, a fragment of her journey woven into silk and thread. Customers responded with enthusiasm, often asking for the story behind each design, and Clara found joy in sharing not just the artistry but the intention, the resilience embedded in every creation. For the first time, her work felt like a bridge between her inner world and the wider community. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the boutique that would shift her perspective yet again. It was an invitation to speak at a women's empowerment conference in Manhattan, an event gathering entrepreneurs, artists, and survivors. Clara hesitated, nervous about speaking publicly again despite the success of her memoir. But Lila, sensing her mother's apprehension, said gently, "You've been through so much, Mom. You know what it's like to fall and get up again. They need to hear that." Clara smiled, realizing that her daughter's words carried not just encouragement but recognition of the strength she herself sometimes forgot she possessed. The conference was a whirlwind of emotion. Clara shared her journey, heartbreak, financial ruin, scams, and eventual recovery, not as a tale of vengeance, but as a testimony to perseverance. Eyes glistened in the audience, hands clutched notes, and when she finished, the applause felt both grounding and surreal. Afterwards, women approached her to share their stories, to ask advice, to simply say thank you. Each encounter reinforced a lesson she had learned long ago, that healing and hope were far more powerful than retribution, and that the ripple of resilience could extend far beyond herself. Returning home that evening, Clara felt a contented exhaustion. Lila had stayed late at a friend's art studio, and the apartment felt unusually quiet. Whisker padded across the floor to greet her, curling up beside her feet as she sank into the sofa. Clara looked around, observing the walls lined with Lila's evolving artwork, the books stacked neatly on shelves, and the soft glow of lamps that created a cocoon of warmth and calm. She realized that life had become a tapestry of moments, some challenging, some joyous, all intertwined, and that she was finally able to witness it fully without the shadow of fear or regret. As summer approached, Clara began planning a series of workshops for young women in underprivileged neighborhoods, combining art, entrepreneurship, and practical lessons about financial independence. Lila often helped, teaching children to sketch and encouraging them to see the beauty in small details. The work was rewarding in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. She watched these young women, their faces bright with possibility, and felt a deep sense of continuity, as if her own struggles had paved the way for their potential. It was in this giving back, in this gentle empowerment, that Clara found a profound sense of fulfillment. Evenings remained sacred. She and Lila would sit on the balcony, Whisker nestled between them, and talk about dreams, fears, and fleeting thoughts. Sometimes they would watch the sun set over the skyline, painting the city in hues of pink and gold. Other times they simply enjoyed the quiet hum of life unfolding below. Clara often reflected that peace was not the absence of struggle but the presence of acceptance, gratitude, and connection. Every hardship she had endured, every tear shed, every sleepless night had been part of a path leading her to this gentle equilibrium. By the end of the year, Clara's boutique had become a well-loved destination, her nonprofit efforts had expanded, and her relationship with Lila had grown into a partnership built on trust, love, and mutual respect. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer dictated her present. Life had returned not with grandiosity or spectacle but with quiet, sustained beauty, a rhythm she had fought hard to reclaim, a peace she had longed for in the darkest moments, and a legacy of resilience she knew would continue to ripple outward. Autumn returned to New York with a gentle nostalgia. the streets painted in shades of amber and burnt orange, and Clara felt it as a quiet celebration of all that had been endured and all that had been reclaimed. She walked Lila to school each morning, their scarves fluttering in the crisp air, exchanging stories and plans for the day. Life was no longer a scramble to survive, it was a careful choreography of work, creativity, and connection. Clara found herself savoring moments she had once taken for granted, pausing to watch a pigeon hop across a stoop, greeting neighbors, listening to Lila's enthusiastic chatter about school projects and friendships. These small joys had become her grounding forces, reminders that life's richness was often found in the ordinary. At the boutique, a new shipment arrived, silk blends imported from Italy that Clara had spent months selecting. Each piece carried not only the promise of artistry but also her persistent vision, beauty crafted from patience, resilience, and careful attention. Customers arrived with anticipation, and Clara took pleasure in sharing the story behind each design, how it reflected not only the city she loved but the journey of survival, perseverance, and hope that had defined her last decade. Some bought scarves, some simply lingered, absorbing the atmosphere, and Clara realized that the boutique had become more than a shop, it was a sanctuary, a testament to transformation. Lila's art had grown exponentially, her work now displayed in small galleries and receiving attention from local collectors. Clara watched her daughter navigate the art world with confidence and grace, yet always returning home to share victories and disappointments, seeking her mother's counsel as much for comfort as for guidance. One evening, Lila excitedly presented Clara with an idea for a collaborative project, a limited edition scarf line inspired by Lila's illustrations. Clara's heart swelled with pride and affection. Together, they spent evenings sketching designs, testing colors, and discussing how each piece could carry a story of resilience and hope. Their bond deepened through this shared creative endeavor, weaving threads of mutual respect, love, and understanding into the very fabric of their lives. The nonprofit work Clara led also continued to expand. She organized workshops teaching financial literacy, entrepreneurship, and artistic expression to women facing economic challenges, creating spaces where vulnerability and ambition coexisted. Every story shared, every tear shed, every laugh echoed through the halls reminded Clara of the far-reaching impact of resilience. She discovered that giving back was not a burden but a source of profound satisfaction, an extension of the lessons life had painfully taught her. Evenings were still the moments she treasured most. Clara and Lila often sat on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below, whiskers stretched lazily between them. They talked of dreams, fears, relationships, and the future, a ritual that had grown into a sacred space of connection and trust. Clara reflected on how far she had come, from nights of despair and betrayal to a life where love, creativity, and hope guided her steps. She recognized that the scars of the past were no longer chains but threads woven into a tapestry of strength, wisdom, and perseverance. As the months passed, Clara began to dream quietly about the future. She envisioned expanding the boutique into a larger space, offering workshops and exhibitions that combined art, fashion, and empowerment. She also thought about travel, perhaps taking Lila to Europe to explore art history and culture, experiences that had once seemed impossibly distant. The life she had built was not without work or occasional setbacks, but it was rich, intentional, and deeply satisfying. It was a life defined not by loss but by the conscious choice to live fully and authentically. Winter approached, and with it came the familiar hush of the city under frost and light snow. Clara prepared the apartment for the season, decorating simply, enjoying Lila's excitement as they baked cookies for neighbors and friends. The warmth of these shared moments, the quiet rhythm of daily life, reminded her that happiness was not found in grandeur but in connection, in giving, and in the persistent act of showing up fully for oneself and for those she loved. Clara knew, deep in her heart, that she had finally found a sense of closure, not through revenge, not through wealth or recognition, but through the unwavering cultivation of peace, love, and resilience. The winter in New York settled into a calm rhythm, the quiet snow muffling the city's usual clamor and wrapping Clara's world in a reflective hush. She found comfort in routines she had carefully curated over the years: early mornings with coffee and her journal, quiet walks with Whisker around the neighborhood, and evenings spent beside Lila, sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes tears. The boutique remained a source of steady fulfillment, and Clara often marveled at how far she had come from the days of financial instability and relentless anxiety. Now, each challenge was met with patience and a measured mind rather than fear and desperation. Lila had blossomed into a confident, independent young woman, her art continuing to attract attention from galleries and private collectors alike. She confided in Clara about her ambitions for the future: an art residency abroad, collaborations with established artists, and eventually, her own exhibitions. Clara encouraged her, sharing not just advice but also the lessons of perseverance and emotional resilience she had learned herself. There was a joy in watching her daughter carve her own path, a quiet pride in knowing that the strength Lila displayed was nurtured by love, guidance, and example. One particularly cold afternoon, Clara received a phone call from Alan. They had remained in sporadic contact over the years, and though the pain of their past lingered, there was a mutual respect that had developed over time. Alan had remarried, but he wanted to meet, not out of obligation but out of acknowledgement for the chapters they had shared and the lessons they had taught one another. Clara agreed, curious to see the man who had once been both a partner and a source of heartbreak, now transformed by his own journey. Their meeting was quiet, civil, and surprisingly gentle. They spoke of the past without recrimination, sharing reflections on growth, resilience, and the power of forgiveness. By the end of the conversation, Clara felt a subtle closure, a recognition that some wounds heal not by forgetting but by understanding and moving forward. The boutique had grown beyond her initial dreams. Collaborations with local artists, charity events, and special exhibitions turned it into a hub of creativity and community engagement. Clara found joy not just in the business success but in the connections it fostered, the empowerment it brought to women, and the platform it provided to showcase both art and resilience. Lila often helped manage small projects, learning about business and collaboration firsthand, and their shared endeavors strengthened the bond between mother and daughter. Spring arrived once more, bringing with it a renewed sense of vitality and possibility. Clara began a personal project she had long postponed, a small book compiling letters, sketches, and reflections from the women she had mentored through her non-profit. It was a labor of love, a way to honor their courage, document the impact of community, and leave behind a testament to survival and hope. Working on it, she realized that the narrative of her life had shifted completely, from one of pain and desperation to one of empowerment and shared triumph. Each story included in the book was a reminder that life's hardships could be transformed into lessons and sources of inspiration. Evenings on the balcony became a sacred ritual. Clara and Lila, wrapped in scarves of their own design, would watch the city lights dance across the streets, sharing dreams and reflections. Whisker, ever present, purred between them. Clara often marveled at how the ordinary could feel extraordinary, how small acts of care, creativity, and connection created a life of profound richness. The past no longer haunted her. It existed as a tapestry of lessons and memories, woven into the fabric of who she had become. By mid-year, Clara's boutique had received recognition in local press, not for wealth or glamour, but for its authenticity, its commitment to community, and the stories it carried within each design. Invitations to speak, collaborate, and mentor continued to arrive, but Clara approached them selectively, choosing projects that aligned with her values and allowed her to maintain the balance she had worked so hard to cultivate. She had learned that true success was not measured in accolades or material gain but in the quiet satisfaction of living authentically, making a difference, and nurturing the people and passions that mattered most. As another winter approached, Clara reflected on the decade that had passed, the heartbreak, the scams, the nights of despair, and the tireless struggle to reclaim her life. And yet, sitting in her warmly lit apartment, surrounded by Lila's artwork, the soft hum of city life, and the comforting presence of Whisker, she felt a profound sense of peace. The past had shaped her, but it did not define her. She had rebuilt, healed, and flourished. Life, she realized, was not about perfect endings but about resilience, love, and the courage to keep moving forward. Clara decided to take a small trip with Lila, just the two of them, away from the bustle of New York, to a quiet town upstate known for its rolling hills and artisan communities. The trip was spontaneous, born from a shared longing for fresh air and perspective. They drove along winding roads, past fields dotted with early blooms, listening to music and sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for the future. Lila, sitting in the passenger seat with her sketchbook open, captured sketches of farmhouses, barns, and the colors of the hills, her enthusiasm infectious. Clara felt a serene joy she had not realized she was missing, the simplicity of being fully present, away from deadlines, appointments, and obligations. In the evenings, they would settle into a small inn with creaking wooden floors, fireplaces that radiated warmth, and windows framing the sunset over distant hills. Clara began to write again, jotting down reflections on the journey, her own growth, and the lessons of resilience she had witnessed in both herself and the women she had mentored. Lila often sat nearby, sketching quietly, occasionally showing her mother a drawing that captured a fleeting expression or emotion. They shared meals, laughter, and the occasional deep silence, each moment a reinforcement of the bond they had nurtured over the years. Returning to the city, Clara felt reinvigorated. She poured this renewed energy into both the boutique and her nonprofit efforts. The workshops she hosted became more interactive, drawing in larger groups of women who sought not only business knowledge but also emotional support and encouragement. Clara listened to each story, offered guidance, and celebrated each success, recognizing that the empowerment she had cultivated rippled far beyond her own life. She began to document these stories, compiling them alongside her own reflections, preparing what she envisioned as a second book, a tribute to resilience, community, and the power of shared experiences. One late afternoon, while closing the boutique, Clara noticed a familiar figure at the door, an older woman with kind eyes, holding a scarf she had purchased months ago. She introduced herself as Mara, and as they began talking, Clara learned that Mara had endured a series of financial setbacks and personal betrayals, yet she had slowly begun to rebuild her life with Clara's guidance in mind. Over the course of several visits, Mara became a trusted friend and collaborator, helping Clara organize workshops and exhibitions while sharing her own story of transformation. The connection reminded Clara that life's healing was often found in the shared journey, mutual understanding, support, and the courage to keep moving forward. As summer approached, Clara and Lila organized a joint exhibition, a combination of Lila's art and scarves designed collaboratively by mother and daughter. The event drew crowds from the local community, art enthusiasts, and customers who had followed the boutique's journey over the years. The gallery space was filled with laughter, discussion, and reflection. Women approached Clara, expressing gratitude for the inspiration, for the sense of possibility she had ignited. She realized in that moment that her life had evolved into something far larger than she had ever imagined. Her past heartbreak and financial struggles had transformed into a platform for empowerment, creativity, and hope. The quiet moments at home remained sacred. Clara and Lila, wrapped in scarves and blankets on the balcony, watched the sun set over the skyline. Whisker purred softly between them. They spoke of aspirations, fears, and fleeting thoughts, their conversations a mixture of introspection and shared amusement. Clara often reflected on how far she had come, from nights of isolation and fear to a life rich with purpose, connection, and love. She understood that closure was not about erasing the past but integrating it, honoring its lessons, and moving forward with intention. By the end of the year, Clara had launched a mentorship program for young women seeking to start their own businesses. The program emphasized financial literacy, creative expression, and emotional resilience. She worked closely with Lila, who shared her artistic expertise and served as an inspiring role model for the participants. Watching these young women grow, gain confidence, and take steps toward independence brought Clara a profound sense of fulfillment. The life she had once thought shattered had become a conduit for change, not just for herself but for countless others. As the city prepared for winter once more, Clara looked out over the skyline from her apartment, the streets sparkling with holiday lights. Lila was sketching at the table, whisker curled on the couch beside her. Clara sipped tea and breathed in the warm, comforting scent of home. Life had not been easy, but it had been rich in growth, love, and resilience. She understood now that true peace was not the absence of struggle but the embrace of life in its fullness, with all its unpredictability, challenges, and joys. And in that embrace, Clara found a deep, abiding sense of closure, gratitude, and hope for all the chapters yet to come. Winter fully descended on New York, blanketing the city in pristine snow that reflected the glow of streetlights and holiday decorations. Clara walked the quiet streets with Lila, hand in hand, savoring the crisp air and the occasional swirl of falling snowflakes. Life had settled into a comforting rhythm, but it was no longer routine, it was intentional, a deliberate weaving of creativity, love, and connection. Clara reflected on her journey, the heartbreak, the financial turmoil, the scams, the nights of despair, and the painstaking climb back towards stability and fulfillment. Each challenge had left its mark, yet it also carried a lesson she now cherished. The boutique continued to thrive, a space infused with both artistry and community. Clara had expanded her collaborations with other local artisans, turning her store into a gallery, a workshop space, and a hub for women seeking mentorship and inspiration. Lila's artwork had gained recognition beyond the city, with galleries in other states inviting her to participate in exhibitions. Watching her daughter grow into a confident, thoughtful, and ambitious young woman filled Clara with a quiet, enduring pride. She understood that her struggles had not just shaped her own resilience, they had created the foundation for Lila's courage and creativity. The nonprofit initiatives flourished as well, touching the lives of dozens of women each year. Clara personally mentored many of them, sharing not only business strategies and artistic guidance but also lessons in emotional resilience, perseverance, and self-compassion. She found that her greatest joy was in witnessing the small, transformative moments, women discovering their confidence, taking risks, and ultimately reclaiming control over their lives. The acts of giving, guiding, and listening had become her own source of healing, reinforcing that true fulfillment came not from wealth or recognition but from connection and the ripple effect of positive change. Clara and Lila maintained their sacred balcony evenings, wrapped in scarves of their own design, gazing over the city that had once felt so overwhelming and unforgiving. Whisker purred between them, a small but constant presence of comfort and companionship. These moments, though simple, were infused with significance, a celebration of survival, of love, and of the peace they had both cultivated. Clara often marveled that after all the chaos, the betrayals, and the financial struggles, life could be so full, so rich, and so deeply satisfying in its quiet triumphs. One afternoon, Clara received a letter from a distant relative she had not spoken to in years. It carried an invitation to a family gathering in upstate New York, a reunion that she had once feared attending due to old judgments and expectations. This time, however, she accepted with a sense of calm and readiness. At the gathering, she was met with warmth, curiosity, and respect. Conversations flowed easily, free of the tension that had marked previous interactions. She realized that healing and closure were not solely personal endeavors, they also allowed for reconnection, forgiveness, and understanding in relationships long strained. As the year drew to a close, Clara prepared for the quiet reflection that winter always brought. She reviewed her journals, sketches, and notes, seeing the growth mapped across time in tangible form. The scars of the past were visible but no longer painful, they were part of the tapestry of her life, woven into a narrative of resilience, love, and hope. She wrote letters to the women she had mentored, to Lila, and even to herself, acknowledging the courage, persistence, and grace that had carried them through. Each word was a testament to survival and a celebration of the life she had built from fragments of heartbreak and struggle. On New Year's Eve, Clara and Lila stood on their balcony, gazing at the fireworks illuminating the skyline. Whisker perched on the railing nearby, eyes reflecting the bursts of color. Clara held Lila close, feeling the weight of the years, both the heavy ones and the joyful ones, and she whispered a silent gratitude for every lesson, every tear, and every triumph. Life had not been easy, but it had been profoundly meaningful. She had found peace not in perfection but in acceptance, growth, and connection. And as the city roared its celebration below, Clara felt a deep, unwavering sense of closure, contentment, and hope, a life fully reclaimed, fully lived, and fully loved.